Hi, I'm Molly McGregor and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. My supervisors are Life as a Parody and Martin Halvey. And I'm here to tell you about our cheer paper, Untangling Cost, Effort and Load in Information Seeking and Retrieval. So in this presentation, I'll firstly describe our main aims and the key research questions. I'll then briefly provide a theoretical overview of how cost, effort, and load terms have been defined in other research fields. Finally, I'll describe the themes which emerged from our literature analysis, and in particular, the main issues alongside some recommendations. So within the context of information seeking and retrieval, search behaviours such as the number of queries issued have been described in one study as a measure of effort and in another study as a measure of cost. Likewise, time on task has been used to measure cost, effort and load across several different studies. These examples pose the question of which concept is actually being measured. So cost, effort and load are important and salient factors considered in most ISR studies. And to date, these concepts have been measured in a variety of different contexts and conditions. Yet despite this recognition, there are still no universally accepted definitions of these concepts within the field. The motivation of this paper is to untangle how these concepts have been described and measured, and with this establish a shared taxonomy of cost, effort, and load definitions. So the following research questions guided our analysis. The first two research questions relate to how cost, effort and load are currently being defined in the ISR literature. Are there any overlaps in the terms or definitions used, or are there clear distinctions? The latter two relate to how these concepts are currently being measured and the relationship between these. So for over 50 years, cost, effort and load concepts have been discussed and explored extensively across fields such as psychology, ergonomics and human factors. Yet universal definitions of these concepts are still yet to emerge. Firstly, cognitive load and workload may appear to represent different concepts. However, both are theoretically underpinned by the same core assumptions. While shared definitions of these concepts have yet to be established, a more general view is that cognitive load and workload are imposed by the demands of the task on an individual's mental resources at a given point in time. Terms such as mental effort or cognitive effort are often used interchangeably, even though they are essentially describing the same thing. While there is no single definition of effort, there appears to be agreement that effort refers to the total amount of cognitive resources allocated to the demands of a task over time in order to achieve a goal. So in comparison to effort and load, cost has been described in a more abstract manner and assigned various different meanings. For example, cost has been implicated as energetic or effective costs, like fatigue, as economic costs, so assigning monetary value to costs, or as a temporal cost, where time is considered expensive. So to examine the extent to which these concepts have been defined and measured within information seeking and retrieval, we conducted a literature review where just under 400 papers were reviewed and 26 papers that explicitly proposed measures of cost, effort and load were selected for analysis. So to answer research questions 1 and 2, the definitions used in the articles were analysed. So 18 of these papers included a definition and 8 did not. So the individual elements of each definition were then thematically separated, categorised and quantified, which resulted in the emergence of 5 conceptual categories. And you can see these categories in the middle part of this diagram. So the two main categories which emerged from the cost definition was cost as being time orientated, relating to the time spent during the user system interaction, and interaction orientated count based, so the number of actions occurring between the user and the system. 3 categories emerged from the effort definitions. So again, the category interaction orientated and count based that we observed for cost definitions was also used to define effort. Effort was also described in terms of metacognition and conscious awareness, which refers to effort as a volitional and conscious process. And lastly, effort was referred to as a cumulative total work of physical or mental work that the user applied towards an outcome. The first 2 categories to emerge from the load definitions were cumulative total work, which was also used to categorize effort. And the second describes load as capacity-based and resource-bound, referring to the limited resource capacity of the human brain. So we can see clearly that cost, effort, and load are sharing the same conceptual categories, or at least some of the same conceptual categories. This diagram also represents how these concepts have been measured and the relationship between the measures and the concepts. Similar to the lack of universally accepted definitions of cost, effort, and load, there appears to be no single or standardized method to measure these concepts. And again, different concepts are seen to share the same measures. So 3 main issues were brought to light following our analysis, and I'll discuss each of these in more detail in the next few slides. So firstly, there's a clear overlap in the metrics used to measure different concepts. For example, number of queries issued, number of documents opened, and number of pages viewed have been implicated as both a measure of cost and as a measure of effort. Likewise, time on task was used as a metric for all 3 concepts. Now, these observations not only highlight conceptual overlap, but they also reflect the challenging aspect of using interaction methods more generally. How can we correctly relate these signals to complex concepts like effort or load? And are these methods actually measuring what they claim to measure? Search interaction logs cover a variety of different actions ranging from a simple mouse click to viewing a whole document. As observed from 5 of the studies, these actions are often count-based. However, it's not clear how we can compare, say, the total number of clicks to the total number of queries examined. Are clicks more costly, more effortful, or more load-inducing than queries? Likewise, how do we compare different interaction times? For example, is the time spent reading a document more costly than the time spent browsing result items? It's also assumed that these actions have fixed values of cost or effort. However, every user interaction with the system is unique in terms of their experience. So while these interactions can be directly observed, they actually only offer an indirect glimpse into the cognitive activity of the user. So another issue which emerged was the level that the concept was being analysed at. So load is considered to be dynamic and to fluctuate throughout the task. However, the majority of studies measuring cognitive load analyse results at the task session level. So this can only really provide a post hoc indication of cognitive load and the shifts in cognitive demands on the user during the search interaction. So these shifts in cognitive demands are unlikely to be exposed through average values. So when cognitive load differences are absent at the session level, it's possible that they might actually exist at the task stage level. So several of the studies measured load as a singular concept. However, as proposed by cognitive load theory, there are actually 3 different types of load. So these studies may struggle to identify which type of load is consuming the user's cognitive resources during a task. So finally, from our analysis, cost, effort, and load were measured at least once through self-designed questionnaires. In questionnaires claiming to measure effort, for instance, we observed a large variety of questions with different formats, scales, and units, making them almost impossible to compare. Problems with the concept used and the unit used to measure it also came to light. For example, time was employed as a unit of effort and as a unit of cost in another. The problem is that both of these studies are making claims that the same metrics have measured different concepts. Even using well-established self-report measures can also be troublesome. Over half of the studies used the NASA Task Load Index for comparing workload across search systems. However, the tool is designed to measure workload among tasks, not systems. This consequently leads to uncertainty about the claims made in these studies. There's also been significant debate about the over-reliance of the NASA TLX as a workload measure, with claims that it lacks sensitivity and predictive validity compared to other questionnaires. So the key challenges which emerged relate to the need for a stronger theoretical and conceptual underpinning of these concepts, and also more precise and accurate methods of measurement. So to help address the first challenge, and differentiate between these cost, effort, and load concepts within an ISR context, we created a tentative framework for defining these concepts. This diagram here on the left represents these definitions and shows the proposed relationships between the concepts. So people have multiple resources available to them, And these resources can be internal, meaning they can either be cognitive, for example, their working memory or attention, or they can be physical, for example, energy or strength. People also have external resources available to them, such as money, time, or labor. And all resources are considered to be limited in capacity. For example, the number of items we can hold in our working memory or the amount of time available to complete a task. And these capacities are not fixed and may vary over time. For example, through training, a user might increase the working memory capacity of their brain, but if they're stressed or tired, then this capacity may be reduced. And demands can emerge from the properties of the task system and more generally the context. So demand will regulate how much of the internal resources need to be exerted or expended, or how much of the external resources will need to be paid or spent to perform the task. Demand is dynamic and will fluctuate throughout the course of the task. So given a particular resource and the demand imposed, load can be conceptualized as the amount of resource being consumed at a given point in time. An overload can occur when the demands of the task, system, and context exceed the capacity of the resource. So effort reflects the total amount of internal resources that are exerted or expended over a given period of time to meet the demands. And finally, cost can be distinguished from effort specifically in terms of the resources they relate to. So cost is considered with respect to the external resources that are spent or paid by the user in order to meet the demands. This diagram to the right shows the relationship of the load experienced by a user over time for a given internal resource. So when the load demanded by the task, system, and context exceeds the capacity of the user's resource, then they hit overload. And the effort experienced by the user is the total load expended over time. So this area here under the curve. So the second challenge relates to the precision and accuracy of the methods currently used. So the majority of self-report measures used in the studies were not validated. So to help validate and support self-report findings, we recommend using a multi-method approach to measurement, combining both subjective and objective measures. However, a key direction for the field is to establish more reliable and valid self-report instruments which can accurately represent these concepts within an ISR context. Objective measures such as dual task and eye tracking already offer dynamic and real-time assessment of concepts such as cognitive load during a search task. However, the key challenge is ensuring that the unit of analysis used to measure the concept can accurately reflect its conceptual properties. For example, as cognitive load is dynamic and instantaneous, it should be measured at the task stage level rather than calculating average values across a search session. Finally, to more accurately visualize the detailed trends and patterns of cognitive load in real time, a key progression for the field would involve the use of more sophisticated sensors such as fMRI, where resource consumption in the brain can be measured directly. While these methods offer an exciting avenue for the future measurements of cost, effort, and load in ISR, their widespread use during in situ or naturalistic experiments is currently quite limited. However, it's worth exploring a variety of different methods to determine the trade-off between their scalability and accuracy. So finally, in this presentation, we've reviewed how cost, effort, and load are currently being used and defined within the ISR literature. We also identified key issues and how these concepts are being used and measured. Finally, we introduced a working definition framework, which we hope the ISR research community can benefit from. We also actively encourage others to use and build on these definitions with their own research to help develop a more unified approach in understanding and researching these important concepts. With this, we anticipate a refinement of existing measures alongside the development of new ones, which will inevitably make comparison and generalization across studies more achievable and lead the field to a greater understanding of these complex concepts. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.